The roots of American Sign Language, or ASL, go back hundreds of years, to a time before America was even a nation, to a tiny island off the coast of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard. Some of the colonists from England who settled there at the end of the 17th century were deaf and carried a gene for deafness. By the mid-19th century, there was a large deaf population on the island, and they all spoke sign language. It had developed organically through natural socializing, and most of the hearing people there spoke it too. It isn't there anymore. The deaf Martha's Vineyard residents started to leave the island in the 1800s to attend the first American school for the deaf, established in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817 by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Gallaudet was a preacher who began to research methods for educating the deaf after meeting his neighbor's deaf child. He traveled to England to observe a method of training for speech and lip reading, but the developers of that system were protective and unwilling to give away their secrets, and turned him away. So he went to France, where he was welcomed to the School for the Deaf in Paris, which used sign as a method of instruction. He convinced Laurent Clerc, a deaf teacher and graduate of the Paris Deaf School, to accompany him back to Hartford, where they founded the American School for the Deaf. The school began with a mixture of sign systems. There were many students who used the Martha's Vineyard sign, and they came together with deaf students from around New England, some of whom had rudimentary gesture systems only used in the home, and some with more developed systems that were used in towns with other deaf people. In school, they were exposed to each other, to Parisian Sign Language, and to a method for visually representing some aspects of English. And ASL was born out of the mix. Today, ASL is much closer to French Sign Language than it is to British Sign Language, which has no historical connection to ASL. Over the course of the 19th century, deaf schools opened all over the U.S., and many graduates of the Hartford School took their signing with them to careers as teachers and principals across the country. ASL became the language of the American deaf, deepening and expanding over generations of use. That process hit a roadblock in the 1880s when proponents of oral education, including Alexander Graham Bell, convinced many schools to discourage sign language in favor of speech training. Suddenly, students were forbidden from signing, punished by having their hands tied behind their backs. They spent hours learning to mimic mouth shapes to produce vowels and consonants, hours they had once spent learning math, history, and literature. But ASL lived on in the shadows and under the tables. It wasn't until a century later that attitudes toward ASL began to change back. Research began to show the benefit of having a full, easily acquired language as early as possible, and the harm of not having one, which happened to many deaf kids who could never manage to acquire speech. Deaf people became politically empowered and advocated for giving ASL the respect it deserved and had earned through more than 2 centuries of American history.